We're closing out this module on geology by talking about some of these geological debates on the theory of the Earth. You've already read a little bit about some of these theories of the Earth, and you've watched a few videos that talk about Charles Lyell and James Hutton. So you know a little bit of their background. We're going to talk more in depth historically about some of these ideas, and then about these geological debates and what types of ideas we're really going to be getting into today. Some of the debate happened because of the different theories of the Earth, not just having to do with how long the Earth has been around, but who created the Earth and why the Earth was created. So we're going to talk a little bit about this science versus religion type of debate that began happening around the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century. Make sure you pay attention to a lot of these details because you're going to be reading some primary sources after you watch this short video, and then you will be doing a response on this, so you need to have some idea of the historical context before you read the sources, and then you'll do a response. So we're talking about William Paley and Charles Lyell. Who are these guys? We're going to talk about them a little bit more in depth here, but first I want to explain their historical context. Both men are coming from late Enlightenment thinking. This is the period basically at the beginning of the 19th century where philosophers have said, you need to use reason, you need to use your rational faculties in order to understand the world around you. The quote at the top of this page says, "Dare to know, have courage to use your own reason." And this comes from Immanuel Kant. And this is in opposition to the idea that we should just listen to what the ancients have told us. So men like Hutton and Paley and Lyell have begun, thanks to the scientific revolution and other things like that, to not so much depend on Aristotle and these previous thinkers before them, but to do their own investigations of the natural world. And you can see from this image here that scientific and rational thought literally brings light to a situation, and that's what's going on here. Another point that they're coming from is Newton's mechanistic worldview. Isaac Newton had postulated that God created the universe as a machine. He set it up according to his own laws, wound it up, and then let it go. And the universe, therefore, behaves based on God's laws that we can figure out through our reasonable faculties. But the universe is in itself God's machine that he put into motion. And so both Lyell and Paley, although they're coming from different theological backgrounds, are coming from this same philosophical background. So that's some of where they're. Furthermore, both Paley and Lyell had read James Hutton's Theory of the Earth that was published in 1795. Hutton was a Scottish farmer who used his farm to observe particular mechanisms of change on the earth. One of the main things was water erosion in his fields. He noticed that when it rained, the rain tended to take some of the earth away with it, and he decided if it does this in small bits on his farm, then what does it do to the rest of the earth? So he started researching this. He started observing all over Scotland to find evidence of water erosion, and what he came up with was this idea, his theory of the earth, that God created the earth at some point way, way long ago. We can't ever know how old the earth is, and set it up according to his laws, and we don't really see a prospect of the end of the earth. So he says there's no vestige of a beginning to the earth and no prospect of an end. And everything that we see changing our earth today, changing the surface, is what has changed the surface of the earth since the beginning, since God created the earth. We've seen Hutton's unconformity on the left. This is Hutton's drawing of Siccar Point in 1788. After he went there, you saw in the video about Hutton that he went there. And these ideas of how the earth has eroded and changed in order to form these types of strange geological formations. So both Paley and Lyell have read Theory of the Earth and have understood this idea of deep time, this idea that the Earth is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old, as well as this idea called uniformitarianism, which is what Hutton came up with to explain the mechanisms that change the Earth. So William Paley is the first to sort of write in response to what Hutton is talking about. Paley, as you can see here, was the Archdeacon of Carlisle. He was a Protestant theologian. He disagreed with what Hutton had to say. He believed that Hutton was going against the biblical story in Genesis and argued that there was no deep time. He believed and agreed with Archbishop Usher that the earth is young, that it was created in 4004 BC, which would put the earth at about 6,000 years old. And he wrote a book called Natural Theology in 1802. What is natural theology? Well, the beauty of 19th century cover pages is that the subtitle usually tells us what's in the book. So here we have natural theology, or evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity collected from the appearances of nature. That's what natural theology is. He defines it there for us so beautifully. Another way of saying this is that natural theology is basically the proof of God's existence through nature. So we can see the proof of God's existence through God's works. Because for William Paley, we needed two things to study nature. We needed God's works, which were nature all around us that we could observe, and God's Word, which was the Bible. So he said these two things will help us to understand nature, and we can see God's existence through these things. You're about to read a small piece of natural theology, but first I want to introduce to you what famously became known as Paley's argument from analogy. In the very first paragraph of Natural Theology, he proposes this argument to his reader. He says, in crossing a heath, which is just a big field, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? So here we have two items, a stone and a watch. And in Paley's argument here, he argues that both the stone, being a part of nature, and the watch were created things. They were both created by something or by someone, and both based on their complexity, that proves that there has been a creator, and that there must be some sort of design behind having the stone in the heath and having the watch do what the watch does. So here he compares the stone and the watch as nature and a created machine. And so he analogizes their creation. He argues further on in Natural Theology, which is what you'll read about, is that both the watch, because of its complexity, and the stone being in nature, because of nature's complexity, must have had a design, and if they have a design, they must have a creator. What we need to understand and remember, however, is that natural theology is not early intelligent design. Intelligent design and natural theology are actually very different. They're similar, but they have different conclusions, essentially. We have to understand that natural theology looks for evidence of God in nature and the Creator, and using this analogy of the watch and the stone to argue for complex design in nature. Paley clearly understood that God created the earth and designed it in a particular way. And he was using this watchmaker, this machine, to argue that as well. About 30 years later, Lyell writes his Principles of Geology a little bit in response to William Paley, kind of to argue against natural theology, but he doesn't do it as explicitly here as he argues against some other works within Principles of Geology. What we have to understand about Charles Lyell is that he was trained as a geologist and as a lawyer. So he's coming from a different philosophical background, although their historical background is the same. Lyell and Paley are coming from different philosophical backgrounds. So Lyell's coming from, a lawyer's background where you look at the physical evidence and then you present, your conclusions. Whereas Paley was using God's works and God's word. Well, what is geology? We've already kind of defined it based on Lyell's writings, but here you can see again the beauty of 19th century cover pages. And here we have the Principles of Geology being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. That is, in essence, what he believed geology to be and how he set up this new science of the study of the changes of nature. And he based this on the reference to causes now in operation, which is Hutton's uniformitarianism. And he publishes this in 1830. He publishes it in response to Georges Cuvier's theory of the Earth from 1812. Cuvier was a Frenchman who had been studying fossils and geological strata in France. And he had asked this question of extinction. How is it that animals go extinct? Cuvier's explanation was very different from Lyell's explanation, and we'll talk about those different mechanisms here in a minute. But we've seen this definition of geology from Charles Lyell. Geology is a science which investigates the successive changes that have taken place in the organic and inorganic kingdoms of nature. It inquires into the causes of these changes. So Lyell's 2-volume work then goes on to explain what the causes of these changes are, and none of them have to do with a deity. They have to do with physical mechanisms that happen on our Earth's surface. So what is this mechanism that Lyell is responding to directly in his Principles of Geology? Well, it's Georges Cuvier's idea of catastrophism, or basically the idea that change in the Earth's surface is caused by catastrophic events such as a large flood, volcanic activity, earthquakes, anything that happens that is dramatic and traumatic for the Earth's surface and very, very quick compared to, the long mechanisms of change of rain and things like that Lyell was arguing for. So for Cuvier, he explained these mass extinctions that he'd been studying in, the geological strata, because he would find fossils within the strata. He would explain the fact that this could actually even happen at all by the fact that floods must have laid down all of this sediment, and then when the floodwaters receded, it hardened and had killed all of the animals in the area. Cuvier's idea actually very much influenced the belief in natural theology in England, and Cuvier's ideas of catastrophism became extremely popular in Britain at the time. And I want you to start thinking about why that might be. For Charles Lyell, who was writing in direct response to what Cuvier was saying, he argued that Hutton was in fact correct. He said uniformitarianism, this change on our Earth's surface, is very gradual and uniform. So mechanisms like rain, water, streams, rivers, yes, there may be catastrophic events that we can witness like floods, but those aren't the main things that cause change on our Earth's surface. It is these uniform mechanisms, gradual mechanisms that cause change over millions of years. Lyell actually said millions of years, and that freaked people out. Another part of Lyell's theory of change is actualism, and we saw that in the cover page, where he talks about the causes now in operation. It's the gradual and uniform change by mechanisms that we can see now. When it rains, you can go out in your yard, and you can see that sometimes the rain forms these little drainage ditches that cause, small valleys to form in your yard. These are the same changes that happen on Earth and other places. So Lyell argues against catastrophism, he argues against natural theology, and argues for a very, very, very old Earth. We can see that there could be some issues with both of these mechanisms. Well, what were some issues with catastrophism? While catastrophism does help explain mass extinction of large animals, as you can see in this image here, so floods, drown out things like dinosaurs or other large animals and other large plants, and bury them in sediment so that we can find them millions of years later in the fossils. It also doesn't explain erosion by water or erosion by wind. So there are some problems with some of these catastrophes. Uniformitarianism helps to explain how different layers in the geological strata are laid down. And you can see here that there are, a number of different layers in particular types of geological strata all over the Earth. What it also helps to explain is how the land would get eroded away so that we can actually see the geological strata that's laid down. One main problem with uniformitarianism is that it needed deep time. So you get these young Earth creationist philosophers who argue that the world is only 6,000 years old and all change has happened through catastrophic events. Whereas uniformitarianists say, we can see that these catastrophic events happen, we recognize earthquakes, we recognize floods, but it's mainly these very slow and gradual processes that allow for change, and because of that we need deep time. Hutton argued for possibly hundreds of thousands of years, and Lyell argued for hundreds of millions of years in time. Very few people would go as far back as Lyell wished to go. They thought it was a little bit extreme. But as you can see, there are some issues with some of these mechanisms, and those are the ones that you need to think about.